Hey everybody, this is the guided practice video for section 7.2 in the week 2.3 module. We're going to be multiplying and dividing fractions. When multiplying fractions, we multiply straight across, top and bottom. When dividing fractions, you multiply the first expression by the reciprocal of the second expression. And when multiplying or dividing, do you need a common denominator? And the answer there is no. You only need a common denominator where you're adding or subtracting rational expressions. So let's dive right in. And using our guidelines here for problem number 1, our first order of business is if this isn't multiplication, rewrite it as multiplication. If it's division, we would want to rewrite it as multiplication, but this happens to be multiplication to begin with. So our next step is to factor every single numerator and denominator. And that's going to look something like this. In our first numerator, we're going to factor out an 8, and we're going to get r plus 4. In our first denominator, if we factor out a 24, we'll get r minus 1 times. Now, this next numerator can be a little bit tricky. If we do factor out a 6, we'll get 1 minus r. And what we're going to have here is what's called an opposite factor. 1 minus r and r minus 1 are opposite factors. And so when we go to cancel those later, we won't be left with 1. We'll be left with negative 1. Or alternatively, what you could do here is, instead of factoring out a positive 6, you could factor out a negative 6, and that would change this sign to a negative 1 and this sign to a positive r, which you could then rewrite as, in opposite order, instead of negative 1 plus r, we could write that as positive r minus 1, and then we can see our common factors. So we had that opposite factor, and instead of pulling out a positive 6, we pulled out a negative 6 there. So we'll just leave that like that. And then in our second denominator, if I factor out a 3, we'll be left with r plus 2. So canceling these common factors, we're left with 8 times r plus 4 over 24. I'm going to actually write as 3 times 8, so I can cancel those 8s. Times, in our second expression, I'm going to rewrite the negative 6 as a negative 2 times 3 over 3 times r plus 2, so that I can, in fact, cancel some of those numerical values. And what we're going to be left with, if I write it in a slightly different order, when we multiply straight across, top and bottom, is a negative 2 times an r plus 4 divided by a 3 times an r plus 2. Now there's no more common factors to cancel, so we'll just go ahead and distribute across the top. We get negative 2r minus 8, and on the bottom we get 3r plus 6. And that is our simplified answer. Okay, so let's move on to problem number 2 down here. Problem number 2 is division, so we're going to rewrite that first as 2m squared minus 5m minus 12 divided by m squared minus 10m plus 24 times, so we're now going to use the reciprocal of our second factor. Now the numerator is m squared minus 9m plus 18, and our second denominator is 4m squared minus 9. So step number 1 is done. We've rewritten the division as multiplication. Now we can move on to step number 2. I'm just going to move this arithmetic over here. We're going to now rewrite everything in factored form. So let's see, we've got a couple of big fractions here. Hopefully I'm leaving enough room. And we're going to do our best to factor all numerators and denominators involved. Probably the easiest one to factor is going to be the denominator in the second term. That 4m squared minus 9, that's a difference of squares. Let's see, that'll be a 2m plus 3 and a 2m minus 3. The hardest one to factor is probably going to be the numerator in the first term, or the first factor, because it has that leading coefficient that's not 1. So let's see, that's probably going to be a 2m and an m. And of course, this is the point where you want to exercise your ability to practice factoring here. But I think, let's see, if we do a 3 and a 4, we'll have 2 times 4, which is 8, minus 3 will give us that 5, or if I do a negative 4, I'll get a negative 8, plus 3 more will give us that negative 5 in the middle. And that looks good. That looks like how that factors. For our first denominator, let's see, we're going to have m and m, two numbers that multiply together to give me 24, but add together to give me negative 10 are going to be negative 4 and negative 6. And then for our second numerator, we'll have m and m, the real Slim Shady. And let's see, two numbers that multiply together to give us 18, but add together to be negative 9 are a negative 6 and a negative 3. So now we've factored. It's now time for us to go look for some common factors to cancel. We've got a 2m plus 3. Let's get rid of that. We've got an m minus 6 and an m minus 4. And it looks like that's it. Yeah. So we're just left with an m minus 3 over 2m minus 3. And that's our simplified form. There it is. We've reduced it to lowest terms, as they say. Okay. Everybody doing all right out there? Okay, let's go to number 3 here. For number 3, it's division. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this as multiplication by the reciprocal of the second factor. And now it's time to factor everything. So let's see. X plus 1, x minus 1, that's a difference of squares. Not a lot going on in this denominator. 2x times x plus 1 divided by, I could pull out a 4 here, but again we're going to run into that opposite factor. So instead of pulling out a 4 and getting 1 minus x as the leftovers, instead I'm going to pull out a negative 4 and be left with x minus 1. So that I can, in fact, cancel some of these common factors. And it looks like that's all that's going to cancel. And I'm going to be left with an x plus 1 over 2x times an x plus 1 over negative 4, which is going to be x plus 1 squared over negative 8x. And our last little statement says, do the reciprocal blank the factoring. I would say do the reciprocal before the factoring, but that's just like my opinion, man. Anyway, there you have it. And it looks like that's all of our problems. So this is our simplified answer. You could multiply out that x plus 1 squared if you wanted. X squared plus 2x plus 1 over negative 8x. You could actually write that a couple of different ways. You could write that as the negative of the fraction x squared plus 2x plus 1 over positive 8x with that negative out in front. Either way, all of these are perfectly acceptable. Okay.